I believe we can get started, and those who are late will join us in the next few minutes. Good evening, everybody, and I'm pleased to welcome you at this last colloquium in our spring series. And today I'm delighted to introduce Roger Schwarzschild, our speaker today. Roger is a professor of linguistics at MIT, where he teaches graduate courses in semantics, and it is semantics that has benefited from having Roger in it in various ways. His contribution into our understanding of various types of natural language expressions has transformed the field tremendously. Roger is famous for his work on plurality, starting from his UMass PhD dissertation entitled Degree Plural Noun Phrases, which later on resulted in his famous book on pluralities. And since then, Roger has been active in various areas of formal semantics, including degree semantics, semantics of comparatives, measure phrases, temporal semantics, semantics of given and focus, information structure in general, and event semantics, of course, which is going to be the topic of his today's talk. In this brief introduction, it's just impossible to list everything Roger has accomplished, but I'm sure many of you have seen and appreciated a recent textbook, Roger and two other distinguished semanticists, Terence Parsons and Daniel Altshuler, published recently in 2019, which is entitled A Course in Semantics. And I believe it's one of the most fundamental, thorough, comprehensive introductions into our field. So, Roger, we're enormously pleased to have you here today. Welcome to the Department of Theoretical and Applied Linguistics. I hope everybody will join me in welcoming you here. So today, the title of Roger's talk is Noun Meanings in a World of Events and States. Roger, welcome to the department and welcome to the colloquium.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Do you hear me? Yeah. So yes. Thank you very much for that. Was really generous introduction. I wish I was in Moscow. I've never been there. And I welcome you all to my home. I don't know if you can see it very well, but in the background, there's a picture there on the wall. That's an award that my grandfather was given by the Pan American Airlines. And he was given that because he was a passenger in a flight that crossed the equator. So the good news is that I don't have jet lag. The bad news is I can't be with you in Moscow. I'm going to share my screen that I already uploaded the handout to the chat. And here's the screen. And you can see that, right? Yeah. Okay. So I want to start by going over some meanings that are assigned in Neo-Davidsonian semantics. So in the first sentence, you have Jack was driving slowly, and that gets interpreted as there's an event in which Jack is the agent, and it's a driving event, and it's a slow event. This is an event, a Davidsonian event semantics, because the verb has an event argument, and it's a Neo-Davidsonian event semantics because it only has an event argument. There's a separate, and then the adverb just attaches to that, describes that event. It's also Neo-Davidsonian because it extends not only to event predicates, but also statives. So Jack owns Loon Lake gets interpreted as in two. There's some state that Jack is in. It's an owning state, and the theme of that state is Loon Lake. This kind of semantics has been extended as well to adjectives. There's a very recent paper by Lilia Glass in which she argues for this extension. And this is a crucial part of Alexis Wellwood's work on comparative. So that's an example of that is in 3. Al is older. Wellwood would interpret that as saying there's a state of oldness that Al is in, and it measures greater than some degree that's mentioned in the discourse. And then the last case of a Davidsonian semantics involves predicate nominals, and that's the one that'll be of most interest to us today. So Mary is a doctor, comes out as there's a state that Mary's in, and it's a state of being a doctor. And here's a quote from Parsons. Mary's state of being a doctor is a different state from John's state if he's also a doctor. Both are different states of the same kind. That is, both states are in the extension of the common noun doctor. So being a state of predicate doctor in this way of thinking would naturally be a predicate of states. The thing is that if you look at implementations of Davidsonian semantics, they almost never treat noun phrases as states overall, except in these few cases. And so what I want to do, the project for today, is to see if we can produce a semantics in which nouns are correctly interpreted always as predicates of states. We're going to cover a couple of types of issues that come up in the semantics of noun phrases. So we'll talk about reference, what a DP is referred to in this kind of a way of analysis, and how to mass and count nouns differ. We'll talk a little bit about modification. So how does modification work? Quantification, what are you counting if you're in a semantics where nouns describe states? And then predication, how do DPs combine with other predicates like verbs and adjectives? And the lesson will be at the bottom, recognizing that nouns are one-place predicates of states will lead to some new ideas about types of noun meanings, about adjective meanings, and about how they function in the grammar. Okay, so I want to begin by introducing a few tools that we can use in the analysis. So we'll start with simple sentences of reference and predication. And here are some of the tools that we're going to use. I'm going to assume that a little s is a variable over states, and the big S is a variable over sets of states. I'm going to make use of this participation relation, which I write as in. So that's in 6. X in S means X is in state S. And the choice of that particular English word is motivated by the examples on the right over there. That we say things like, this house is in a starry state. That office was often in a state of chaos, and the guests were in a state of panic. The next tool that we're going to use is this predicate that involves participation sharing. So it's going to be a relation that relates to states or sets of states, and it says that they have the same participants. So for example, in 7, if I have two states S and S prime and they share participants, it means any entity that's a participant in one is a participant in the other, and vice versa. And then you can connect two sets of states and a state, or two different sets. So at the bottom in 7, the set of states S and S prime share participants. That means any entity that's a participant in any of the states of S is also a participant in in a state of S prime, and vice versa. And the last piece of meta language that we'll be using is the star operator, and that should be familiar to you from plural semantics. So the plural noun doctor is translated as star doctor and star doctor. Now remember, we're in a semantics in which nouns describe states. So a pluralized noun, star doctor, will be true of pluralities of states, or like a set of states. In that case, it would be a set of doctor states. Okay, so now I want to use some of these tools to start to look at some simple sentences. And the first one we'll look at is the sentence, the book is heavy. And I'm going to analyze that as an 8. There's some state, which is a book state. It's unique. The uniqueness has to do with the choice of the. There's some state, which is a heavy state. Those are different states, but they share the participant. So the participant in the book state, the object that makes it a book state, is the same object that is in the heavy state. The predicate in the middle, unique, like I said, that has to do with using a definite. I'm not going to say anything about that till much later in the talk when I talk about quantification. So from now on, I'm going to ignore that part of the interpretation. 8 is a simple sentence with a singular subject, and now we're going to look at two plurals, examples with plural subjects. Plural sentences can be understood distributively or collectively. So first, the distributive reading, the books are heavy, the reading in which each book is heavy. So that's in 9. There's some set of states, they're book states, And for all s, for every one of them, there's some state of heaviness that it shares participants with. So each one of the books ends up being heavy. That's the distributive reading. The collective reading is the one in 10. The books are heavy. There it says that there's a set of states, they're book states. There's a single state, which is a heavy state, and all of the book states share, their participants are in that heavy state and vice versa. That means that that heavy state exists because of the weights, the combined weights of all the books. It's not just a single book. And that's the collective reading of the books are heavy. So one of the things that we've covered here is you can already see how you do predication in such a semantics. And there's an important distinction that comes up in 10 that we're going to be tracking. And that is that you have plurality at two different levels. So you can have plurality within a state. You can talk about a state that has many participants. And in the example in 10, S prime is such a state. It's plural on the level of participants. It has many books in it. There's also plurality among states. So you can have plurality on the level of not the participants in the states, but sets of states. And that's also in 10. That's the capital S. With this much of an analysis, we can use these tools to try to give an explanation for an analysis of what I call stubborn distributive predicates, and I'm going to describe that now. Before we do that, just let me point out another thing about these examples. The collective distributive ambiguity, that ambiguity corresponds to multi-participant and single participant. So the books are heavy, describes a heavy state that's multi-participant. The books are heavy on the distributive reading, describes many states that are single participant. Okay, so now I'm going to explain to you what stubbornly distributive predicates are. An adjective is stubbornly distributive if it's missing a collective reading that we'd expect it to have, given its interpretation. So let me explain by way of this example in 11. So if I say this table is small, that basically means that the table takes up little space. So I'm using the example in the 11 to sort of point out that small paraphrases as takes up little space. Now you look at the sentence in 12, these dots take up little space. That sentence has two readings. I think the more prominent reading is the collective reading. If I say these dots take up little space, you probably have a picture of a picture in which there are dots and they're only in a small area. That sentence also has a distributive reading in which it means each dot takes up a small amount of space. That sentence is ambiguous, that it's both readings, but if you replace take up little space with small, you lose the collective reading, the more prominent one. So these dots are small cannot mean that the collection of dots is in a small area. It can only mean that each of the dots is small. And so I'm referring that as stubbornly distributive, meaning in theory, there should be a collective reading, but this predicate holds on to the distributive reading and only allows it. So that's what I'm calling stubborn distributivity. Small is not the only stubbornly distributive predicate. In 14, I've listed a bunch of them. So big, large, enormous, those are size predicates. Those are all stubbornly distributive. Long on its temporal and non-temporal senses, so a long line or a long phone call. Short, you also have the predicates like spherical, cubical, square, shape predicates. Interestingly, the predicate multilingual and interracial, those are also stubbornly distributive, and the intransitive verb grow is also stubbornly distributive. If you want to on your own, you can go back and use kind of the paraphrase way of discovering the stubborn distributivity, the way I did in 12 and 13. Another way to do it is to use a group noun. So you can get back the collective reading of a stubbornly distributive predicate by using a group noun. So in 15, the collection of dots is small. That has an interpretation where you're talking about the area taken up by all the dots. That's exactly the reading that's missing in 13. So for each one of the predicates in 14, you can similarly recover the missing reading by using group nouns. What I did here was I described stubbornly distributed predicates. What would be the analysis? What can we say about a predicate that would explain its stubborn distributivity? Using what I introduced in the previous page, I want to make the following claim. A stubbornly distributed predicate has only single participant states in its extension. How does that explain the missing reading? Well, in 17, what I did was I gave the analysis of the collective reading the same way I did earlier with heavy. Remember, the collective reading involves a single state that that's multi-participant, so that's in 17. The collective reading would be there is a set of dot states, there's a single small state, and they share all the participants. If they share all the participants, that would mean that S prime has many participants, but that's exactly what 16 doesn't allow. So that's that's how 16 explains how the collective reading is lost. 18 gives you the distributive reading, and that's fine. What it says is for every one of the dot states, there's a small state that shares participants, and that's possible because there would be a single participant. Now, I'm interested here in stubbornly distributed predicates because these kinds of predicates came up in earlier discussion in the literature in discussion of mass nouns. They weren't described as stubbornly distributed predicates, but they arose in discussion of mass nouns. And so what I want to look at now is the connection between stubborn distributivity and the mass and massive count. So the first place that they came up is in the distribution. And Quine made this observation that there are certain adjectives that tend not to occur next to mass terms. And his example was spherical wine and square water. Moravchik said, well, we should extend the count mass distinction. That's normally the way we classify nouns. They should also be extended to adjectives. And he, in fact, called the adjectives that Quine was referring to count adjectives. It turns out that Moravchik's count, what he calls count adjectives, are just stubbornly distributive adjectives. And so, given this history and the analysis that I gave a minute ago in 16, I'm led to the following idea that when we say count, what we mean is predicate of single participant states. So it looks like there's a connection here between being count and being a predicate of single participant states. I'm kind of free associating a little bit here, but that looks like there's that connection. That connection I arrived at by the distribution, by the way, the things that the adjectives can combine with. You can also see a connection between stubborn distributivity and count in the morphology. So there's a term singulative. A singulative is an affix that can be used to form count nouns. And in some languages, diminutives are used as singulatives. So there's a paper in language by Jurafsky in which he looks at uses of singulative, all kinds of various uses of singulatives. And among the ones that he looks at are singulatives used as, diminutives used as, the paper is about diminutives. And one of the things that he has is an example in which diminutives are used as singulatives. And his examples are in 19. Now, in that paper, he tries to explain how you get from the diminutive meaning to the various uses that are made of it. And he actually has a little bit of a problem when he gets to the singulatives. And that's because the notion of smallness doesn't really seem to explain how they end up naming count nouns. And it doesn't seem to be preserved. And my analysis of this situation is that diminutives, what normally happens is some of the meaning gets bleached, and that's how you extend meanings. That's what's happening with singulatives. But what is bleached, I claim, is the notion of smallness, and what's left is just the stubborn distributivity. Remember, I'm assuming that stubborn distributivity means single participant states. So this, in 20, the bottom line, the diminutive affix creates a predicate of single participant states, and that makes it a count noun. And that's the sense in which it's a singulative affix. So now I want to look at the conclusion that I drew from both the discussion of Quine and Moravchik and of the affixes is given in 21. And this is my hypothesis. A count noun is a predicate true only of single participant states. That's what it is to be a count noun. That hypothesis actually was implicit when I was discussing the book examples, because when I was talking about them, I implicitly assumed that every book state had a single book in it. And so I really was assuming 21. There's the corollary of 21. Well, if single participant state is what characterizes a count noun, then the idea would be that mass nouns describe multi-participant states. Thinking of mass nouns as describing multi-participant states can be characterized as in 22. A state in the extension of a mass noun may include a plurality of participants. That's what makes it a mass noun. Now, what 22 does is it connects up the notion of a mass noun and plurality. It connects up plurality of participants. The connection between mass and plurality is present already in the literature, but I claim it's not correctly located within states, but people have noticed that there's a connection between them. They just put it in the wrong place. So I just want to mention some places where it comes up. The very term mass includes the idea of plurality. So here's a dictionary definition of mass: a dense aggregation of objects. So the term mass itself has the idea of plurality in it. Then there are theories in which people sort of, as a theoretical claim, connected plurality with mass. So this is from Laycock. The proposal is to construe any mass term as a plural sortal of the form M elements. You can see he had the notion of plurality. I claim he put it in the wrong place because he was talking about he wasn't talking about participants, but the notion of plurality is there. Famously, Gennaro Kirchia's theory says mass nouns come out of a lexicon with plurality already built in. You can also see plurality associated with mass nouns in dictionary definitions of particular mass nouns. So rubble is a mass noun, and it's defined in the OED as waste fragments of stone, plural. Okay, with this hypothesis in hand that count nouns are predicates of single participant states, I want to take a little bit of a look at the morphology of mass and count. So we've already seen some of that. There are singulative affixes, and those are affixes that mark count nouns. There are also affixes that mark mass nouns. And the example in 23 is from Asturian. This is an example of a language that has a marker for a count noun. The crucial point about this example is that the marker is a gender affix. So in 23, you have the masculine singular u, which is the first gender affix. Then you have the a, which is feminine, and then on the word for hair you have the o, which is the marker for mass. In a recent paper by Franco, Manzini, and Savoia, they looked at these kinds of data, and in fact data in a number of languages, and they arrived at the conclusion in 24. We have provided evidence from a set of typologically diverse languages for mass count distinctions performed at the n-class level rather than by number projections. Why did they say rather than by number projections? Because in the past, people have noticed that there's a connection between mass and plurality, and having a simple grammar where they couldn't distinguish between the two levels of plurality, they just assumed that they were all on the same level, and so they assumed that the affix would have been where the affix is when you pluralize count nouns. But what we see in Asturian and in other languages is that the marker for mass count is actually lower in the noun phrase. So they have the structure, and Franco and et al. Have the structure in 25. They have the root. They would have the root pel, and then the o would mark it as mass. They're operating in a semantics where nouns describes objects. So the only way that you could say mass is by saying something about the object. That's why they have minus individual. My proposal would be, instead of saying that, it should just say plural, where we understand that this is the kind of plurality where it means multi-participant plurality. So now I want to illustrate this idea of having the plurality lower in the noun phrase or higher in the noun phrase by looking at the English word directions, which actually has both uses. So the root direction is ambiguous. It has a count interpretation and it has a mass interpretation. The count interpretation is in 26. The Roman god Janus looks in two directions. The two there is counting it. And that's the count interpretation, where it looks left and right at the same time. Then there's a mass interpretation. So you must carefully follow all directions to avoid eye injury. That noun, it sort of has the meaning of instructions. It's a lexical plural, but it's a mass noun. It can't be used with numerals. So it's you can't say I followed many directions, or there are 2 directions on this package. It doesn't combine with numerals because it's a mass noun. The syntax there is I claim as in 30. On the mass interpretation, there's a plural, which in fact in the lexical plural is the same exact, sounds the same, but it's lower down. It's a plural that marks mass, namely that it's plural on the level of participants. And then if you look at the count interpretation on the right, the root itself is singular. That is, it's a single participant noun. Then there's the star operator, so you get lots of states. Then there's the higher plural, which is marking plurality of states. So in effect, the internal syntax of noun phrases is sort of iconic in the following sense. I call the ones on the mass interpretation directions, I call that an inner plural. It's inner in 2 senses. It's inner in a syntactic sense because it's inside the noun phrase. It's inner in a semantic sense because it's inside the state. And then the plural that's on the count noun is an outer plural. It's outer in the sense of the syntax. It's outside the NP, and it's outer in the sense of the semantics. It's external to the state. It tells you that there are many states. Okay, I want to now look at an example that a kind of example that is discussed often in the mass count literature, but show how the ideas that I've been discussing up to now can be applied. And I want to look at what are reciprocals and other plurality seekers. I call an expression a plurality seeker if it requires in the sentence a plural, an outer plural antecedent. So expressions that are outer plurals examples are each other, floated and ad nominal each, both, together, internal same. So you and I had the same dish, internal different, and one by one. These expressions, the ones that I've listed over there, they show that the distinction between inner plural and outer plural, which I just illustrated in the syntax of the noun phrase, is also felt external to the noun phrase. So the predicates that are outside the noun phrase also recognize the difference between the 2 levels of plurality. So we're going to just look at the reciprocal case. 31 is odd. This definition contradicts each other. That sentence is odd. The analysis of the sentence is in 32. There's a state. It's a definition state. I just put the meaning brackets there, whatever the meaning of contradict each other is. So I'm not giving the full analysis, but whatever it is, it's a meaning that applies to a state, the definition state, the one that's in the extension of the nouns, the count noun state. This example is ungrammatical, and the conclusion from that is that the meaning of contradict each other is a predicate that only applies to a plurality of states. So if we pluralized it, it would be fine. These definitions contradict each other. Now I'm going to look at a noun that we looked at a second ago, which is marked with an S. In fact, agrees with plural, but but that's a plurality that's on the level of participants. It's not a plurality, it's not an outer plural. So that's in 33. The directions on the shampoo bottle contradict each other is also no good. Why should that be? Because the analysis is as in 34. There's some state, it's a direction state, and contradict each other applies to it. That is a single state, even though it has multi-participants in it, and so the sentence is no good. You can improve the sentence by forming a plurality of, so the problem here is not that it's a mass noun. The problem here is that it's a single state. You can create a noun phrase that will have 2 of those states, then you'll have many states, and then you'll have an outer plural. So that's what I did in 35. The directions you gave me and the directions he gave me contradicted each other. That's okay because now you have 2 states, and the analysis would be as follows. The directions you gave me would pick out a state S1. the directions he gave me would pick out a state S2. Those are both multi-participant states, but that doesn't matter here. Then the AND creates a plurality. It makes a set of those two states. And so 38A, the directions you gave me and the directions he gave me contradicted each other. That says there's some set of states, but the two that are there, and contradict each other applies to it, and that's fine because contradict each other wants a plurality of states. Okay, before we go to modification, I just want to sort of repeat some of the things, review some of the things that we've done. So the crucial question of how you do predication in this kind of a grammar is by making use of the share predicate that relates two states to each other. What we saw was, in principle, there's two kinds of plurality. So you could have a state that has many participants, that's participant plurality, or you can have a state, many states, that's interstate plurality. The language cares about them. There are affixes that will indicate participant plurality, and other affixes that in the syntax will indicate state plurality, or be markers of state plurality. And crucially, the mass count distinction is the distinction of single participant versus multi-participant. Now I want to say a few words about modification, how modification works, and it really will just be certain aspects of it. The textbook analysis of modification is given in 39. So what you see in the textbooks is that if you have an example like gray cat, gray combines directly with cat, and the interpretation of gray cat, you just take the interpretation of gray and the interpretation of cat and you intersect them. The syntax in 39, we know from investigation is too simple. That modifiers like gray appear higher in the structure, and there's a whole literature there. I think one of the big names there is Chinque, but there's a recent book by Minju Kim which summarizes a lot of the recent research. So the syntax is already questionable, but I'm interested in this semantics, and I want to make the following negative claim. Modification does not result from combining meanings via intersection. And I want to make, their claim will come in two parts. The first part is that adjective and noun meanings they just can't combine intersectively. And then the second part will be that adverb meanings aren't combined with verb meanings intersectively either. And here I'll be relying on a paper by Higginbotham. After I've demonstrated that, I'll be using the way that Higginbotham says we should combine adverbs with nouns and show how that can also work with some adjectives with nouns themselves. So the first job is to show that adjective and noun meanings can't combine intersectively. So take the adjective gray. Gray describes states. A state, you're in a gray state. Whether or not you're in a state of gray or whether or not an object is gray depends upon the way light is absorbed and reflected by that object. A cat state has to do with whether you're feline or not. You can just see from these descriptions that these states are very different. They can't possibly be the same object, which means that if you intersect them, you'll get the empty set. There is no state which is at the same time a feline state and a gray state. So whatever the grammar is of modification of this kind, it can't be intersection. The second point is about adverbs, and here I'm going to modify what I said in the beginning of the talk. So we started the talk off with the sentence, Jack was driving slowly, and following Parsons, we said that describes an event which is a driving event and is a slow event. And Higginbotham in this paper is actually responding to a point that was made in Geider's dissertation. And in fact, Higginbotham was responding to a paper by Mayenborn. These are in the references. And she was reporting what was in the dissertation. Higginbotham says that the analysis in 1 is wrong. Instead, you should have the analysis in 41. Jack was driving slowly describes an event that's a driving event, and there's a state, which is a slow state, and the driving event is in that state. So the difference between 1 and 2 is this addition that slow is a predicate of states, not a predicate of the event of driving. Higginbotham gave 2 arguments in that paper, in that short paper for this change. The first argument is that the state that 41 is introducing there, in fact, we can refer to that state. So in 42, the slowness of Jack's driving irritated other motorists. In that case, I'm referring to the state of Jack's driving that's introduced in 41 as slow. For Higginbotham, the ness is important to make sure that you have a describe a state. For me, the slow would be a state predicate. But in any case, the slowness of Jack's driving refers to a state. It's that state that 41 introduces. Higginbotham's second argument is as follows. In Parsons' example in 1, Parsons is identifying, in effect, the event of driving with the state of being slow. And what Higginbotham says is that the event of driving is causally distinct from the state of slowness. So here's evidence for that distinction. In 43, the slowness of Jack's driving caused him to be late. That's true. Jack's driving to work caused him to be late. That's false. The driving didn't make him late. It was a slowness. On the other hand, Jack's desire to get to work caused his driving. Jack's desire to get to work did not cause the slowness of a driving. That's false. So both the things that are caused and the things that are causing distinguish between the driving and the slowness, and that's what motivates the analysis in 41. And the conclusion from these last 2 slides, so Higginbotham's claim about adverbs and my claim about adjectives, is that there is no intersective combination. Anytime meanings are combined, there has to be some other way that they're combined. I want to look again at the Higginbotham analysis in 41, because we're going to use that now in a noun phrase. I just want to focus on that for a second in 41. Just what he does is the main predicate, in a sense, is the verb, and it gives an event, but then the modifier introduces a state that the event is in. So we're going to use that now to kind of try to explain a claim in the early literature by Larson about the meaning of the adjective old. So we're applying, our application now is to Larson's analysis of old, and we're going to use Higginbotham modification. The thing that we want to explain is, why is it that the sentence Jack is an old friend doesn't entail that Jack is old? If you look in the dictionary, so this is a dictionary definition of old, they say that old is ambiguous. It can mean long-standing, as in an old friend, or it can mean advanced in years. Following Larson, I'm going to claim that old is unambiguous. So 47, old describes a state, just in case the participant of that state existed for a long time. In 48, you have modification. Old is modifying friend, and it's doing it in the Higginbotham way. So friend introduces a state. Old introduces a new state that state is in. So friend, S is a state, S prime is an old state, and S is in S. Now, if you look at 47, what it follows from that is that the state of being a friend itself has existed for a long time, and that's the long-standing friend meaning. So in that case, what you're saying is the state of friendship has lasted for a long time. Now we're going to analyze the friend is old, and this analysis ought to be familiar to you already, because it's what we introduced in the beginning. The friend is old says there's some state, it's a friend state. There's some S prime, which is an old state, and they share participants. That means that the participant in the friend state, namely Jack, is a participant in the old state. So that means Jack is a participant in an old state. By 47, that means Jack has existed for a long time, and therefore he's advanced in years. The conclusion from this discussion is, following Larson 1998, old is, the ambiguity in old is not lexical, it's syntactic. The long-standing meaning comes from noun phrase modification, and the advanced in years meaning comes from predication. I wasn't going to go over that, but if you looked at some of the reading for today, so the readings by Larson, you see where he has divided up the semantics, the syntax wholesale into those cases where you have true modification inside a noun phrase like old, and then other things like relative clauses and predicates like gray, they come in through predication. We could talk about that later if you want. That's all I'm going to say about modification. I want to say a few words about quantification now, because moving to this idea that nouns describe states has dire consequences for quantification. So we're quantifying and counting now. And I'm going to start again with a quote from Parsons. If a state verb applies to a state that holds over a certain interval, that same verb also applies to substates of the larger state. So if Mary knows Fred for 3 years, then many shorter Mary knowing Fred states hold within that interval of time. If we take this lesson and apply it to nouns like book, looks like we have a problem, because if there's a book state, let's say that lasts an hour, it contains substates that are also book states. And if we say that there are 2 books on the table, that means that there are 2 states and they share participants with an on the table state. Well, then there are 10,000 states or millions of them. So we get the conclusion that there are 2 books on the table should entail there are 10,000 books on the table, which is not a good result. So what I claim is that there's a default constraint, and it's given in 51. So if the domain of any ordinary use of a quantifier contains 2 states S and S prime, then the participants of S and S prime do not overlap. That means that if you have a state that includes one of the books, you can't have another state with that very same book. So this constraint, essentially, it's because of this constraint that we're able, in a grammar in which nouns describe states, to in effect count objects. And there's aspects of this constraint which people already started to notice, so it wasn't in state semantics. And Rouse and Ion and Matushansky and so on, looking at expressions like liters of wine or 100 books. And then there's a big literature, philosophical literature about nouns that describe entities that have proper parts that are the same kind of entity. And all of those require some kind of non-overlap as well. The value of having a grammar in which you have this kind of constraint, but it's a default, is that the constraint can be lifted. And so I'm going to, in a moment, I'll show you examples where you actually want to lift the constraint. Let me point out another thing about this constraint. This constraint is what I had in mind when I said I was going to come back to the notion of uniqueness. So let me just quickly do that. The book is heavy. I analyzed as there is some state. It's a book state. It's a unique state, and it shares participants with a heavy state. If you assume there's exactly one book, and you assume the default domain constraint, that is, if there's one book, then there's only one relevant book state, then you can have uniqueness. The interesting thing about this constraint is that it can be lifted, and these are examples from the literature in which you'd want to lift it. So 4,000 ships passed through the lock last year. The interest in this example is that it can be true if you're counting a ship that passed several times. So this is counting where you're not counting objects. So this is sometimes called event-related counting, and in effect, what you're doing is you're not following the default domain constraint, but rather you're limiting states in a different kind of way, not by what the participants are, but how they relate to the events of lock crossing. Another example in which you want to lift the constraint is in 53A. During her career, she's taught over 100 courses, serving over 2,058 students. That sentence could be true, and it could be true because some of the students took more than one course by that professor, and they may have even taken the same course at the same time. So again, you're counting states. You're not counting states that correspond directly to participants. You're counting states that correspond to enrollments in a course. So when we count, we tend to count based upon the participants, And so we have the default domain constraint, but sometimes we lift it. For those of you that are familiar with this literature, 53A is relevant for the following reason. In a lot of the literature, going back to Carlson, people thought they would solve these accounting problems by assuming there were stages of an individual. And there's was a recent Zinnenbedeutung talk by Matthew Gotham continuing that idea. In 53A, if a student gets counted twice because they're enrolled at the same course at the same time, there's only one stage for that student. So stages is not sort of fine-grained enough, whereas with states you can determine how you want to count them in all kinds of ways. Let me just quickly, because in interest of time, one last thing I want to point out is that when you combine noun phrases with verbs in this kind of a grammar, you can't use the sharing predicate for all of the arguments of the verb. So you can see that in 54. If you have a sentence, a boy taught a dog some tricks. In 55, I tried to analyze that sentence just using the sharing predicate. So there's a state, which is a boy. There's an event, which is a teaching. The state and the event share participants. That so far looks okay, because you want the boy to be a participant in the event. And then it goes on, there's a state, which is a dog, and that state shares participants with the event. That also looks like it's okay, because you want the dog to be a participant in the event. But if you go back to the definition of the sharing predicate, what it says is S shares participants with E. That means every participant in S is a participant in E, and vice versa. So if every participant is a dog and every participant is the boy, then the boy is the dog, and that's not good. Okay, so what this means is you need to have some other way to combine noun phrases with verbs, which we kind of knew already from the literature. And what I have in 56 and 57 are two ways to do that. You can either do it by separating the event into sub-events, like Grimshaw does, and then the boy could be in his event and the dog could be in his event. Or you can treat theta roles as like we do aspects, that is relating events to states, and then the states themselves can be different. You could have a boy state and a dog state. Okay, I hope to have shown you that that it's possible to do modification, to do predication, quantification in a semantics where nouns describe states. And in fact, there are benefits to doing it, understanding the mass count distinction better, understanding how quantification works better, and maybe even some of the motivations of combining adjectives with verbs. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for questions and discussion, and I'm certain there's going to be many. So, dear colleagues, please ask your questions in the chat or by raising your hand in the participant panel.
I think I have to stop sharing to see the chat. Is that right?
Yes, completely.
Okay. So then, oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
So the idea you developed seems to be so new that it may take a bit of time to internalize. Maybe I could start by asking a naive question about what it means for an event to be in a state. For example, both events and states are supposed to have some temporal extent. So when we are saying that an event is in a state, we at least seem to need to relate the running times in some way or other. I'm just curious how we do that.
So so first of all, the runtime of, I think the runtime of this event, if the event is in a certain state, the runtime of the event has to at least include the runtime of the state. In the same way that you know, you could think of a frog becomes a tadpole and then eventually becomes a frog. It's early on in its life, it's in a state of being a tadpole. That doesn't include its whole life, it just includes part of it. I think that the best model, for me at least, a starting point of what it means for an event to be in a state is to think of beginning. So, you know, he's beginning to do something, that means that, or that was the beginning, you know, that's when he started to read the book. So there's an event in which he reads the book and it was in an early stage, and that would be the beginning. So that's a state that you're in at the beginning. It's a good question. So like the Higginbotham thing where you say his driving was slow, I think we understand that to mean the entire drive had to be slow.
Yeah, that's so, that's how it's naturally understood, I think. And can you think of any other possible temporal relations between an eventuality in the extension of a verb and a state denoted by a modifier? Is it always
right?
Like that? I have never thought of that.
Yeah.
But
yeah. The one of the kinds of examples that I didn't.
For example, he jumped high.
Right. So the jump. You're saying the jump is in a state of being high. Yeah. So right. So I was going to say that it is similar. Maybe that's probably a better example, but a similar kind of thing where you say, like, you know, his running across the yard was amazing or something. So that would be another kind of case.
Well, resultatives may be an example of states that are not temporally coextensive with an eventuality.
Right. I was going to say that. So the perfect aspect also, if you think that the perfect of spill describes a state that's caused by the event, then that's not a case of being in it. Yeah. Oh, those are other questions I see.
Yes, that's right. So Mikhail Smirnov, Mitya Privoznov, and Ilya Kuryanov. I lost track of who was the first. I think Mikhail was the first.
No, Mitya was the first.
Mitya was the first. Okay.
No, I wanted to let's let Moscow students ask their questions first.
Not a former Moscow student.
No, I lost all privileges.
Well, okay. You know better. So, Roger, would you like to take questions, or would you like me to do that?
I think your pronunciation of the names is probably better than mine. So
let's find out that. Пожалуйста, Mikhail Smirnov.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have several questions. The first, do you distinguish between collective nouns like pack or heap or bunch and other type of mass nouns like wine or water and so on? It may seem that your approach is plausible only regarding the first type, regarding the collective nouns, but not the nouns like wine or water, because the latter type of nouns seem to refer to something that is completely united for the overt look, at least. Of course, one can say that there are molecules of which water or wine or so on is an aggregate, but this is not a good counter-argument, because people for a long time just didn't know about it. but they used such words. The second question, considering the case with being an old friend and being old, don't you think that the old approach with the usage of comparising classes is enough to deal with such case? And it's like to be a big fly isn't to be big. It only means that that fly is big in comparison with other flies, but not with all other entities. And it seems to me that this approach, the use of this approach, it isn't needed to postulate states in semantics. And the third question, maybe it is the main. So it seems to me that you suggest a kind of monistic ontology in which there is only one kind, universal kind of entities which are states. Well, maybe also there are events and processes, but it seems to me that the very true kind of entities for you is just state. It's okay to postulate such ontology, to outline it, but there is a question: how is it connected to the natural languages and to ordinary human thinking, which stays behind them? Thank you.
Those were great questions. One thing I didn't, you said you had this description of the ontology. What I didn't get what that word. What you said, it's a mechanistic, or what, I forgot what, I didn't hear what the word was.
Monistic ontology. You
Monistic.
Only states as the only.
Is that a person's name?
True category.
What is that? Is that a person's name?
Greek root.
No, monistic, mono.
Monistic from
Only
Greek
one kind of
okay.
entity.
Only one kind of thing in the ontology.
Excuse me for my pronunciation.
No. That was great. Excuse me for my ignorance. So you asked three completely unrelated questions. I think I got all three. The last question, the assertion that you made I think is wrong, because I spoke throughout the talk about the participants in the states. So my ontology has to have entities that are the participants. I suppose if I was crazy, I would say those participants are themselves states, but I didn't say that. So I was assuming that there are objects, there are books, and those objects can be in a state or not in a state. So the other half of that question was how it connects up with human psychology. I mean, that's a hard question. I don't know what the right answer to the human psychology part of that question is, but my point in the beginning was that if you start with Davidsonian semantics, if that is right, then you arrive at the conclusion that the null hypothesis is that the nouns also have states in them. So yeah. That was your third question. Your second question was about whether one could handle old man in terms of comparison classes. Actually, I can't remember, it might have been in the reading, but Larson actually addressed this question already. And he pointed out that old, in the meaning of longstanding, can in addition be involved in a comparison class. So you know, my 7-year-old son may say, I have an old friend, meaning that he's had the friend for a year. My grandfather, who's 80, will say, I have an old friend. That requires a friend. The friend has been for 70 years, and somebody in between may. So old has a comparison class, but it's independent of the distinction. And then likewise, for an old man, those are different comparison classes. So, and I think that Larson said that you have as phrases and for phrases. The for phrases mark the comparison class, and the as phrases mark something else. So, and that the distinction between a long-standing friend and an aged friend is orthogonal to the comparison class distinction. I don't think I can do better than that. The first question was a difficult question. So you said there are two kinds of nouns that I think one wants to distinguish between. I think you used the word bulk. I'm not. Well, let me name two kinds of nouns and then say what I think the question should be about. So there are nouns like collection or portion or pile. Those are all sometimes called collective nouns, and you can have like a portion of soap or a pile of snow. Those form
not
count
portion,
noun
but some collection.
Collection is another one. Collection is a count noun. But I think that those are called in literature, those are called collective nouns. Then there are other nouns, which I think is relevant to the question you were asking, which are sometimes called object mass nouns. Those are things like furniture or luggage,
yes,
or jewelry.
Collective
and
nouns,
I think,
not collection.
Yeah. So I would call them collective nouns like you do. That in the literature, they're not called that because collective nouns is used for things like collection or constant. This is just a terminological point. But I think they are collective nouns. The distinction that you're making is, or I would describe the distinction as the states in the extension of, let's say, luggage have participants, and those participants, we have count nouns to describe those participants. So I can tell you what those participants are. The states that are in the extension of a noun like water or traffic, they have participants, but we don't have words to describe them. We may not even know what they are.
But we usually...
I don't think that we're required to know what they are to know that there are many of them. I mean, just imagine, I see some individuals off in the distance, and I can see that there are a lot of them. I can't tell if they're people or animals or what they are. So you can recognize something when there are a lot of them and not know what the individual parts are. I agree with you about molecules. I would not say that water describes states whose participants are molecules. I don't. And even if I did, I think a lot of the discussion gets hung up in describing words like water because there's such a mystery around them. But if you take a noun like traffic, car traffic, it's a mass noun. I would claim that it describes the multi-participant states. We don't know exactly. I mean, there's some kind of abstraction that's going on there. So I don't think I could tell you exactly what the participants are. And there's no scientific mystery here. I know exactly what's going on the road when there's traffic. So the molecule thing is not something that I agree with the point that you made about the molecule. So let me just, because I said a lot of things, let me just say the short answer to your question is water has multiple participants in a water state. I don't know what they are.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so now Mitya's turn, I think.
I just want to get a pen. Sorry.
Hey, Roger.
Hi.
How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
I had a couple questions. One was about morphological plural. You kind of maybe I missed this part. I don't know, but it felt to me like you were assuming that the morphological plural is always autoplural. it's always forms pluralities of states or not? I mean, can you like elaborate a bit more about the morphological plural, like plural nouns like books, and also pluralia tantum nouns like scissors, and pluralia tantum nouns that are kind of less obvious why they are pluralia tantum in languages like Russian. We talked about this at some point with you. I talked about this at some point with you, where in Russian ink is a pluralia tantum, and it's sort of not clear. So would those be plural states or states with plural participants? That was one question.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. It was one question. And another question was, so that was actually a follow-up on Mikhail's question about whether in your, so I understood that in your ontology, there were also participants, individuals. And the question is whether something, so I assume something like a proper name, Jack, would that be the denoting an individual, and would a pronoun like she denote an individual? And if so, how would they combine with the verb compositionally? Yeah.
So nouns like so English has this noun dregs, which is the garbage that you have at the bottom of the wine when the wine evaporates. Or so that's a lexical plural, and that acts as a mass noun. So I'm concluding that that's a multi-participant state, which means that plural marker, which is lexical, is a marker of multi-participants, and it's a lower mark. It's an inner plural. So it's the same. I think for historical reasons, maybe they developed that way, but it's the same marker. It's the same sound, but it's an affix that occurs lower. So that's yeah. So, and that was my point about looking at the noun directions. That in fact, in one case the S is low, and in the other case the S is high. The second question that you asked was about proper names, and you put your finger exactly on the issue. If predication is understood to be always goes through predicate participant sharing, then you'd have to conclude that Jack describes a state that only Jack is in. And he, if I say Jack went to the store and he bought a tomato, he there describes a state that only Jack is in. So yeah, we didn't know that beforehand, but now that we've been enlightened about what noun means, we have to, yeah. So I mean, that's not very costly, right? Or am I wrong?
Can I quickly follow up on that?
Sorry, and then they would have to be an outer plural. It would describe a set of. Yeah. It would describe a set of states. So if I say Jack and Jill are friends, they picks a set of states, one for Jack, one for Jill. And you can see that because reciprocals are happy with the they. So that's how I know that they're a set of states. Sorry, how does the anaphoric component work? Where's the would it be like would be some anaphor buried in the meaning of he? So he would be more complex meaning, like a state that some G of I is in or something. Well, if the name already introduced a state, then all the pronoun has to do is pick that state up in the same way. Yeah, it just picks up the state that was there already. Yeah. Okay, so that also doesn't go through participants; it goes directly between states. That's right. There's an between states. Yeah, I see. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know what consequences. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
All right. Ilya Kuryanov had a question. Ilya, are you there?
Thanks. Yes, I am. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, clearly.
I hear you.
Great. Thanks, Roger, for the thought-provoking talk. I have a couple of naive questions and a couple of maybe not so naive questions, but we'll see. So first, I actually completely missed the argument about why adjective and noun meanings can combine intersectively. I just don't really see why there can't be a state of both being gray and being a cat. I just didn't get the argument at all. So if you could elaborate on that, maybe that would be good.
So you could have a state that's a state of being a gray cat. That's being that you're in because you're gray and because you're a cat. So a black cat is not in that state, and a gray elephant is not in that state, but only gray cats are in that state. That's perfectly fine. That state is not a state that is a state of being gray and a state of being a cat. So it's not the intersection of the two. It's a combination of them in some way.
Right, because of the if and only if, right?
Right.
So you need a cleverer way of combining states. Yeah, I get that.
Exactly. And I think, I'm not positive, but I think that you really need that if and only if to get things to work, because you really want to distinguish between states of different kinds. So yeah, but that was why. Yeah, exactly.
And the other question is a bit similar. I also didn't really understand the other argument about why adverb meanings can combine with verb meanings intersectively, or rather I didn't understand the let's see if I can reproduce the question. I'm a bit nervous. So in Jack was driving slowly, I don't really think there's any evidence for there being a state of slowness, right? Surely there's evidence for there being a state of slowness in a sentence like the slowness of Jack's driving caused him to be late, or well, basically anywhere where you have the slowness of his driving, well,
right,
there's obvious evidence of there being a state. But well, the obvious way to deal with this is to postulate that ness creates a state, and that doesn't necessarily entail there being a state in a sentence like Jack was driving slowly.
So Higginbotham's point is that if he was driving slowly, before we get to the analysis of the sentence, but if he was driving slowly, there's an event of him driving, and there's a state of the slowness of the driving, and those two things are distinct. Are you with me with that so far?
Sure.
Okay, so once those two things are distinct, now you go to Parsons analysis. It looks funny to say that there's a distinct state of slowness, but the sentence is saying that the slowness applies directly to the event and not to the state. I think that's kind of the. It's the fact that that slow is applying to the. There isn't a separate thing in the in the Parsons analysis that you could then say, oh, that thing is what caused him to be to annoy drivers, not the driving. And so
for sentences like the slowness of Jack's driving caused him to be late, you need a separate thing, which is slowness, right? Even if it's not avert in a sentence like Jack was driving slowly.
Right. And the dissertation that was I think I'm pronouncing his name right, by Goiter, he actually says he's actually opposed to this idea. I mean, he thinks there isn't a state, but he says he arrives at it in a slightly different way. What he says is, how come every other time when we use slow, we say that there's a state that you're in, but yet when it becomes an adverb, we don't say that. So I think he was more of an argument of kind of like consistency across the cement. In other words, when I say, Goiter was like, well, when you say that John is slow, you say that there's a slow state that John is in. So why, when you say the event is slow, you should say the same thing. The event, there's a state that the event is in. So that was how he got to it. And then he was troubled by that. And then Higginbotham said, you don't need to be troubled by that. That's the right analysis. So yeah.
I see. Fair enough. Thanks. Now, a couple maybe slightly less naive questions. So in the derivation of something like directions, you have a root and then the inner s combining with direction, but it's not entirely clear what the semantic contribution of that s is, right? So direction already means like a multi-participant state of being directions or whatever. So s looks kind of semantically empty here. Am I right, or am I missing something?
No, that's an excellent point. So if you go to look at the expression for the count case, if you notice in that tree, I have the star operator. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so there I'm following Sauerland and other people in the plurals literature that say that the plural marker really is a kind of a checker. It checks to see that you have pluralities. That's for things like the boys, right? So you have star and it applies to boys, it gives you pluralities. And then the plurality marker, the inflectional marker, just says, yes, this expression has pluralities in its extension. So I was assuming the same thing for the inner plurality. That is exactly like you said, the root already has multi-participant states, and the marker is just a marker that says, yeah, this one is okay. It has multi-participant states. So sometimes people describe that as saying the markers are kind of just add a presupposition. They don't add the meaning. Yeah.
So thanks.
Yeah.
That makes it clear. So my last question may be kind of a follow-up to the questions of the two previous questioners, which is, it seems as though in this semantics, even if we do have entities in the ontology, it seems they don't actually ever surface in the logical form of any sentence. You have states, you have events, you have like whatever else, but you only have entities as participants of some state. You don't have variables ranging over states. You don't have.
You mean over entities?
Over entities, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
And so forth. Am I right? Or do we sometimes still need states in our logical forms? Entities, of course.
Yeah. So I mean, in a certain sense, I think that is what Michael was asking about. I mean, that's why he arrived at the conclusion that I had a monistic ontology.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, that's an interesting question that I think that's right, that the ontology makes use of objects, but the grammar never refers to them. And in fact, it's in a certain sense because the grammar never refers to them that I was able to say water describes a multi-participant state, but I don't know exactly what those participants are. So I don't see that as a bug. I see it as a feature, but it's correct that I think that's right. We don't ever refer directly to the participants, and yeah.
I'm not saying it's a bug. It's just an interesting consequence.
Yeah. Right. I don't know that much about the literature on the relevant psychology and philosophical literature, but I think there is a view that I mean, I think in our experience, sometimes we kind of, we experience the brightness and we know that it's caused by some entity, but we don't know what that entity is. And, that's what science does. It tries to ask the question, well, what exactly is that entity that's creating the brightness? But so it's sort of, I don't know. I just like to think about it, but that's right. Yeah, that's a feature of the system. Yeah, and it relates to I think that's what Mitya was getting at. That do you ever quantify or refer to entities? And I think maybe we never do.
Thanks for your great answers. I think that'll be all from me. If anyone else has questions, go ahead.
All right, thank you. And we have.
There's some questions in the chat.
A few questions in the chat that have waited for a while to be.
So should I just go through them?
Sure. Yes. The first was is a Boolean's question at 6:58
or 11:58.
It's 11:58.
Hi, Lisa. It's been years. So you're asking about old having the meaning of advanced age, but combining directly with the noun. So here I was relying on Larson's syntax and assuming that when it means advanced age, it's not combining within the noun phrase, it's combining in this other way. So for Larson, he says that it combines actually with a determiner and then it moves. Yeah, so maybe in a cinque world, it starts in a different place. And then its interpretation gets interpreted in terms of predicate, in terms of predication. So I would call that not a predicate modifier, but a predicative modifier. So it combines with the noun phrase by using sharing participants, which is how we understand predication. So, yeah, I think that this is kind of new to me. I don't know if Larson himself buys everything in that analysis, so I don't know what. Yeah, so I don't know exactly where to put it. That's partly why I flubbed and I didn't give us. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, sorry, I wrote it rather than say it. My connection is not really good. So yeah, so you have to,
okay.
Yeah, so you have to have like a sort of a different syntax for those, right? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
and I was assuming that. Yeah.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah, but okay, fine, sure.
Yeah. I think there's a, so you can see this in Kim's book. I think there's sort of a general consensus that in non-intersective modifiers and what object people would call intersective modifiers and non-intersective modifiers have a different syntax, but I don't know how, if it really works 100% of the time, you know. And then there are the cases that Barbara Partee talked about, which everyone always assumed was non-intersective, and then she said they were. So, yeah, okay. So there's a 1208 or 6, what is that, 708? Yeah, no, yeah, 708. Oh, I see. Yeah. So this is the point that so Sergey was asking if an event is in a state, whether that event is always cotemporal with the state. An adjective like former, if it's analyzed as saying it's a state that an event is in, it has to be because at the time at which it's former, the event is over. Yeah. So I guess it's the kind of state that we refer to when we say the exam is over. It's in a completed state. Yeah. I actually related to this follow-up to Lisa's question. I actually find it difficult to no, I take it back. Yeah, a noun like man you'd get the old man can only mean. No, actually that doesn't follow, because old man could just be the man state has been around for a long time. Yeah. Oh, is that your point? Oh, I see. But old professor, I see, is not a professor for a long time. Okay, so yeah, I have to think about this. Well, why can't old professor? Why do you think old professor? I guess you haven't.
I have no idea. I have no idea, but I mean, there must be there must be a difference in nouns, right? So.
And I think they're actually. I mean, I feel like it's kind of ambiguous. That one reading is more salient than the other, and so on. Maybe it's like they're always ambiguous, but one of the reading gets ruled out.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There is actually a third. Well, there's probably more than one, but there's a third reading of old, which means former. So you know I put if I replace the door on the house and I say I put the old door downstairs, it may not have been a door for a long time. It may have been brand new, but it's the former one. So yeah, that's another meaning for old. No.
Yeah, I think in Russian the adjective old has all three, so maybe it's not actually a coincidence.
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. Daniar, is that right? Yeah. So yeah, that's So this is a question in the chat, and the example was a student proved that, I'm reading it now, a student proved that theorem. A couple of years later, he graduated. 100 years later, he died. And the remark is that seems to refer directly to an individual, since the state student is irrelevant because he was no longer a student at the moment of his death. This is a known fact about the temporal interpretation of nouns. So I can say, for example, my father was born in 1950. He wasn't a father then. So there's an assumption here that I don't, I mean, this may be a good point, but it's a point. The question is, what is the participant? So the participant, if the participant could be, you know, an object that lasts a long time, but they participate in the student state, let's say in 1960, then I can say that student refer to that state, is alive now. And then I'm saying that the person who participated in that student state 10 years ago is a participant in a current state. In the same way that I can say my father was born in 1960, that is, the individual who's a participant in my current father state was a participant in a being born event or being born state years ago. Oh boy.
Yeah, I understand it, but it seems that it's referring directly to the participants and not. I mean, there is some involvement of the states, but it is not only states what led Mikhail to call you ontology monistic.
I guess my question is, why can't I sort of get at that participant by referring to a student state that may have ended? When I say he's died or whatever his example was. Do you see what I'm saying? How do you know that you're not using the state to refer to him? I mean, what you say is that the student state is irrelevant. It's certainly not relevant to his dying. And if all I was going to tell you about him was that he died, I would just say Jack died. In this particular conversation, he's been introduced as a student, and we keep referring back to him in that way. We hold on to him in that way, and maybe that is sufficient to pick him out. Yeah. The relevant thing could actually come up, I haven't thought about this, in quantificational sentences. So if you want to say that a quantifier quantifies over relevant individuals, and then you have a quantificational statement that talks about events that are many years later, you may only want states that co-occur with the many years later, and then you would get, then the relevance maybe could interfere. I haven't thought, I'm just thinking along with you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. We have had a long and extensive discussion period. We must have tired you, Roger.
It's morning for me. Well, afternoon. Yeah. And this is great. Yeah. We should do this more often.
We would be happy to invite you to come back as frequently as you can.
Okay.
So
that's good. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Roger for being here for this amazing talk. We really appreciate that. We appreciate that a lot. Thanks a lot, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, and just a brief announcement about the future. That was the last colloquium in the spring series. So the colloquium will be back in the fall semester. Please follow, we will announce our speakers in August, in late August, I guess, for the next semester. And please stay tuned, follow us on Facebook, follow us on VK. We'll be happy to see all of you in the fall. Thanks a lot.